Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A solid topic? Let's do it. What's the creepiest unsolved mystery? Please remember to like, share your own, and subscribe. On Thursday, December 12, 1985, a toddler was spotted wandering unaccompanied around a Kmart department store in Spanaway, Washington, with no parent or guardian in sight. When authorities tried to coax information out of her to help locate her parents, the only piece of information she was able to give was, "Mommy is in the trees." A photo was placed in the local newspaper, and the toddler was soon recognized as Crystal by her maternal grandmother, Louise Conrad, who took her into her care, later saying that Crystal appeared shaken and disturbed, perhaps by something she had seen. So where was Mommy? About 2 months later, the body of Diana Robertson, Crystal's mom, was discovered deep in the forest around Elbe, Washington, with 17 stab wounds and a tube sock tied around her neck. Nearly, an abandoned 1982 Plymouth pickup truck was discovered covered in bloodstains, with a handwritten note on the dashboard simply saying, "I love you, Diana." This truck belonged to her partner, Mike Reamer, an outdoorsman and trapper who often spent time in these woods. Mike, however, was nowhere to be found. Initially, the police believed him to be responsible for Diana's murder, just 2 months prior, on October 19, 1985. Mike had been arrested and cited for domestic assault and malicious damage after an allergy and allegedly kicking in a door at her apartment, throwing her to the floor and rubbing her face into the carpet. They also connected her murder to a double murder that had occurred in the same woods 4 months earlier. A man named Stephen Harkins was found shot to death in a sleeping bag, while his companion, Ruth Cooper, was found strangled 2 months later. Both had a tube sock tied around their neck. So was Mike a serial killer? He had apparently been in the woods at the very time that Harkins and Cooper were murdered, and he certainly knew how to navigate the tricky terrain. But with no trace of him, there was no way to tell for certain. Over 20 years later, on March 26, 2011, a hiker discovered a partial human skull in the woods off of State Route 7 in Lewis County near Mineral, Washington, about a mile from where Diana's body had been found. Subsequent analysis revealed that it was indeed Mike, and that he was likely a homicide victim himself. So, 4 murders in the same woods by an unknown assailant. The question remains, how did Crystal find herself wandering around the Kmart over 30 miles away? She must have been driven there and dropped off, presumably by the serial killer. Crystal must have spent a silent 45-minute drive in the car with the very person who killed her parents, with no memory of the event. Frauke Liebs. She was last seen leaving a bar to go home, then at some point during her walk home went missing. She was able to make several texts and calls to loved ones over the next few days, but was very vague and refused to give information on her whereabouts. The details of her last phone call to her sister are pretty chilling. From Wikipedia. During this conversation, she is said to have answered the question of whether she was being held captive with a faint "yes," immediately followed by a loud "no." Contact broke off after this phone call. Her body was found several months later in a wooded area, most likely dumped somewhere else. No further details were found about the killer, motive for her death, or disappearance. Alonzo Brooks. It is not necessarily creepy in the traditional sense, though it has a long history and is literally close to home. The reboot of Unsolved Mysteries featured an episode about his disappearance. Because of it, after his death initially being ruled undetermined, he was exhumed, and the cause of death was changed to murder, which was always pretty obvious. He went to a party in a small Kansas town, LaKing, with a few friends. Alonzo had some words with partygoers. His friends bailed. Alonzo doesn't come home. The next day, his shoes are found down the road separately. Police searched the area, including a creek nearby the party house. Nothing. A few weeks later, the police let the family do a search after not letting them be involved earlier. His body was almost immediately found along that same creek. Of note, though, is that his body didn't show any signs of deterioration or decomposition that would be expected of someone who had been there for weeks. It's presumed he was in a fight at the party, dragged down the road, and possibly inadvertently killed in a shed nearby the party house that was torn down shortly after. The other effed up part is that it's suggested that his body was kept in a meat locker and covered up by the cops, and when the family tried to get more involved in the search, His body was dumped along the creek, thereby explaining the lack of decomposition. The party had about 100 people there. Someone knows something, and no one is saying anything. I went to a good-sized college party with several friends. The location for the party was out in the woods in the middle of nowhere. The road leading to the party was fairly straight, with one major feature. The road was flat for the entire length, but it had a hill that was about 30 feet tall halfway down it. A pretty good bump in the road, you might say. I was driving, and when I slowly topped the hill, I met a car heading in the opposite direction. That car slowed down to a stop. It was several of my friends temporarily leaving the party to make a beer run to the store. They knew who I was by my vehicle and flagged me down to ask if I needed anything from town. We proceeded to chat for a minute about how the party was unfolding before they left. When we both backed up to talk, we just happened to stop on top of the hill. Mind you, this was not a busy road and was located, as we say, out in the sticks. As we were parked and talking for a brief minute, we all noticed there was a song coming from the surrounding woods. We figured it was someone having a private party in a parked car nearby in the woods, if you get my drift. The odd thing was, it was Turn the Page by Bob Seger, but it was on repeat. We all went on to meet back up and attend the party, and we thought nothing more of our chat on the hill. A few days later, I got a visit from several police officers about an investigation. They learned there was a party that night down the road with the hill in question. They were tracking down all the attendees. This is how they found me. A hunter, the day after the party, found something at the base of a hill off the road. Someone driving another car that night, heading in the same direction down the road I was on, had wrecked their vehicle. The driver took the hill at insane speed and killed themselves in a wreck that had run way off the road. Unsolved mystery that is still ongoing. The police said that they believe the driver they found was not the driver. There were 2 people in the car who wrecked. They found one set of bloody footprints that led to the top of the hill. It looked like someone moved the body behind the steering wheel and fled on foot. They found extra sets of bloody handprints in the car. The wild thing was that they found a CD with Bob Seger, Turn the Page, in the CD player. Everyone who was on top of the hill that night volunteered to give fingerprints. Every so often, every few years, one of us gets a phone call to ask us to recount what we saw that night on top of that hill. Missing person Bryce Laspiza. While he was away in college, he started exhibiting some troubling behavior, and his parents were worried about him. He said he would drive home from college and that he might need a lot he needed to talk about. On the way home, he pulled over like 3 separate times and just sat there for hours. At some point about halfway home, he ran out of gas, and a roadside assistance employee delivered gas to him at 9 a.m. By noon, when he still hadn't arrived home, his mom called the insurance company and was able to contact the roadside assistance employee and have him check on Bryce. He found Bryce in the exact same spot where he had delivered gas to him hours earlier. He had Bryce call his mom, and Bryce said he would be home by 3 p.m. At 6 p.m., he's still not home, and his parents report him missing. The police find Bryce just 8 miles away from where he was previously sitting. He seems fine. They leave. He still just sits there. Again, the roadside assistance employee checks on Bryce and finds him in the same spot the cops left him in hours earlier. Anyway, after a lot of that, when he does finally start heading home, he crashes the car off of a cliff. It was found that he accelerated while descending the hill, so they think he crashed on purpose. Police find the damaged vehicle. There's no Bryce, and he is never seen again. I wonder if there's ever been any updates to Bryce's case. I've read this one before across the years, and want to know if anybody else knows more about it, but pretty odd and fascinating as the details present. Maybe not the all-time creepiest, but certainly in the top 20. Also, one of the saddest is the one who murdered those 4 girls in that frozen yogurt shop in Austin, Texas back in November of '91. Several teen guys were arrested, tried, and convicted, then later had their convictions overturned. Also, the DNA from semen found inside one of the victims didn't match up with any of these guys. In addition, A married couple who left the shop shortly before closing time noted a pair of older and rather sinister-looking guys sitting in the booth next to the counter as they left. There was a man named Titiki Nosti who was in the hospital for abdominal surgery, so he could barely move. One day a nurse came to change the linens, and when she came back inside from being right outside his room, he had disappeared. He wasn't anywhere in the room. The hospital searched up a week up until some men had to perform maintenance on the ceiling. When they opened the ceiling up, they found Titike inside of the ceiling in the fetal position, and he was deceased. The autopsy showed that his death wasn't of natural causes, and someone put him in the ceiling. A few months later, a man named Sandil Sabia was admitted to a different hospital to have his broken femur treated. After a few days there, he was about to be transferred to a different hospital to see an orthopedist, but when they went to get him, he was gone. They looked for him and only found him when a bad smell permeated the hospital. So the staff opened up the ceiling and found Sandy dead in the exact same position as Titike, and they said Sandil also didn't die a natural death and was placed in the ceiling by something. I think that's creepy. Hinterkaifeck, an entire family, father, mother, daughter, granddaughter, and grandson, and their maid that had arrived that day were killed on a remote farm, stacked on top of each other in the barn except for the grandson, who was left in his crib. The maid had previously heard noises from the attic, and the murderer was likely already there a while before the murders. The father had also seen strange footprints leading up to the house, but not away. The murderer also lived in the house for a few days after the murders, and fed and milked the animals. Several people visited the farm in the days following while he was living there, but left without investigating further. Half of the villagers are suspects, as the murderer likely knew the family. One suspect is the neighbor, former lover, or fiancé of the daughter and possible father of the baby. He was accused of being upset over the incestuous relationship between the daughter and her father, who may be his grandson's father. Admiral Richard Johnson is from Minneapolis. In 2021, he was murdered, dismembered, and dumped in very public places over the course of a couple of weeks. His head was left on a park bench and found by a random person jogging by. There hasn't been a single update since October 2021. I believe that despite the brutal, terrifying murder and blatant disregard for his corpse being discovered, the police aren't giving it the attention it deserves because of the previous issues with addiction and mental health. Adam was a father of two who tried his best. No one is perfect. Every murder should be given a proper investigation. The murder of Alistair Wilson in Nairn, Scotland. In 2004, a 30-year-old banker living in a quiet neighborhood has the doorbell of his home rang. His wife answers the door and a man in a baseball cap asks for Alistair by name. So he goes to speak to him. He returned after a few minutes to his wife with an empty blue envelope that had Paul written on it. Confused about this, he went back to his front door, at which point his wife heard 3 gunshots and then found him executed. The murder investigation was one of the biggest in the history of Scotland, and to this day remains unsolved. Although in 2022, the Scottish police announced they believe a planning dispute with a local hotel may have been a motive, and then earlier this year, that they believe the shooting was carried out by 2 people, one of whom was a local suspect who was arrested on drug charges. However, while they now finally have a potential motive and suspect nearly 20 years later, it still has not been solved.